Chapter 2. Wednesday, 9:30 a.m. The Marble Square. Next to the square, within the main bailey, or courtyard, among the other residents heading to and fro, there were strangers dressed in white. They were not residents, but aliens. They had remained in Finite Castle for many years. They were disliked by a lot of the residents, but the head inspector allowed them to stay in the castle. What their mission was, most residents did not know, since the strangers in white spoke another language. The strangers in white were regarded with mistrust and contempt by most, but their actual mission was to protect the castle, although the residents were unaware of this. There were spies in the castle who were always planning its destruction, and the emissaries were their opposites, not residents or natives of the castle, but sent by a kind king and invited to stay by the head inspector. Two of them conferred in low tones about their mission.
So, Zeal, you're heading out now?
Yes, Bold. Then later you and I can discuss the situation further. We know that there will be an attack soon, but these residents do not know this. As you know, I must be there to record the enemy movements, as Emissary Serene will soon be heading back to the king.
Well, I will keep you in mind as I petition the king.
Thank you. Your petitions are my lifeline in success. From what I have seen in other days before now, this attack of temptation on Finite Castle will be big.
Yes, from what Serena's told me, I would think so too. Well, you have tracks to make, so I will see you later, Zeal.
Until later, Bold. Zeal replied with a nod. Wednesday, 9:30 a.m. In a wheat field near Finite Castle. The residents of Finite Castle could be heard and were being observed chatting as they went about their work. Unknown to the two residents conversing and working in a field, a brow with a high forehead was faintly reflected on the viewing lens of a spyglass, hidden beyond a distant tree line.
Apparently, young Aspire, or rather a resident Aspire, has just returned from there this morning. I almost ran into him earlier, and he told me about Victor's Castle's increase in inspectors and guards.
Resident Aspire? I am surprised, Resident Leary said, looking clearly dubious. He seems too shy to say anything to anyone except Head Inspector Cautious.
Well, back to the subject at hand. You must admit that there has been a change in the products coming from Victor Castle. Could there be a connection between the change in its products and the defeat of the enemy?
Resident Resolve knew the answer to this question, but he was trying to get Resident Leary to think. Resident Leary replied, crossing his arms and beginning to bite his fingernails. I have not thought about that, Resolve, replied Resident Leary, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. There are so many things to do and think about. You know, Resolve, I'm not sure if it was me, but there was also there seemed to be a slight dimness in the sun. At the same time, that army that tried to defeat Victor Castle was then itself defeated. It was sort of odd, being that it was the middle of the day. I have been wondering about that ever since. I was wondering about that too, interjected Resident Adroit as he walked up to Residents Resolve and Leary. Resident Adroit was above average in height and had a slim build. He had gray hair and a mustache, although his age was not known by anyone. He looked as though he was in his late 40s. He had an alert manner and was always looking as if he were waiting for something to happen. Oh, hello, Adroit, replied Resident Leary. Hello, Resolve. Hello, Leary, replied Resident Adroit.
We were just discussing Victor's deliverance a couple of weeks ago,
said Resident Resolve. I am not sure if deliverance is quite the word I would use, Resolve, Resident Leary replied, glancing at Resident Resolve with a hesitant, uneasy eye. What do you think it might have been, Adroit? Asked Resident Leary. Well, I don't know, Leary. It's not often I'm outside these walls.
I'm guessing you are too fond of home,
Resident Resolve replied, nudging Resident Adroit on the shoulder in good humor.
Well, it is hard not to be,
said Resident Leary as he glanced at the high noble walls. You know how it is, Resolve, replied Resident Adroit, slapping him on the back. Home sweet home. So you two were talking about the quote-unquote Victor's deliverance? Were there any other ideas you were tossing around?
I'll give you 3 guesses, and the first 2 don't count,
Resident Leary replied, letting out some breath. Ah, that subject.
Yes, Adroit, we were wondering if the king has become the Lord of Victor Castle.
Resident Resolve here actually believes it, based on some report from a young resident who was there recently. Resident Leary replied, poking a thumb at Resident Resolve.
This is worth looking into, especially if it could tie into our own preservation later on.
Resident Resolve said, resting his hands on a rake and looking serious. That is not an easy thing to admit, replied Resident Leary. Well, I can relate to you, Leary, Resident Adroit replied, shaking his head.
I know it's not a popular conclusion,
said Resident Resolve.
But popular or not, it deserves some thought.
I am as anxious as you are to consider it, replied Resident Adroit warily.
Okay then.
Resident Resolve replied, letting out some breath.
This neighboring castle allies itself with the king during a serious crisis. Then, that army miserably failed to defeat it. Victor Castle has also shown great signs of prosperity, not to mention security since then. It does not seem like a coincidence.
Let's not jump to conclusions, Resolve, replied Resident Leary with the look of someone who was groping for words. It would be much better, or rather easier, to have a set of facts to go on for such a claim. I was thinking the same thing, replied Resident Adroit, looking up and nodding. Ouch! Looks like you have quite a hangnail there, Leary, Resident Adroit replied, glancing at Resident Leary.
Well, what about Asunder Castle?
Resident Resolve asked with another sweeping gesture, with one arm still resting on a rake.
The products that come out of that castle became terrible after its rejection of Creator King's help and its subsequent defeat at the hands of the enemy.
Which enemy are you referring to? Resident Adroit replied. Ignoring his reply, Resident Resolve went on.
Have you not heard that there are virtually no inspectors guarding its 5 gates of census? From what I heard, anyone can go waltzing in there. Who was it that told me that, though?
Resident Candid told me the same thing after he visited there 2 months ago, replied Resident Leary, who was still biting his fingernails.
That's who visited Asunder Castle.
Resident Resolve replied, snapping his fingers.
Earlier, I could not remember who it was. If Resident Candid told you that, then there must be something to it. More importantly, you will surely know a castle by its products.
True, replied Resident Leary, nodding his head in agreement, his eyebrows descending in concentration.
This might help you, Larry.
Resident Resolve replied, taking a small, coarse sandstone from his tunic pocket and handing it to Resident Leary.
Back to Victor Castle. Think about the behavior of the people who live there. Sometimes, for one reason or another, they have visited us. I have noticed that they have behaved more kindly after the attack than they did before. Don't forget the improved quality of its products. It would seem for all intents and purposes that Creator King has become Lord of that castle.
Resident Resolve said with a nod in the direction of Victor Castle.
This might also be the reason its name was changed from Faint to Victor Castle. I am informed that the Great Chamber at the top of our Great Tower has only been occupied once long ago. But Resident Aspire told me this morning that the one in Victor Castle was recently occupied. It can only mean that a lord now resides there.
How do you know that? Questioned Resident Leary with a searching look on his face.
Oh, right. Neither of you have read much in the plaques.
I have seen them, replied Resident Leary using the sandstone, but in my opinion, it's a waste of time.
Well, that is where I have gotten this information. Also, those aliens, strangers in white, whom some of you do not like, have also confirmed this.
If they actually spoke our language or would speak up, that would be fine. But when they're around, all I hear is whispered gibberish. How is it that you can understand them and not us? Asked Resident Leary with his head inclined forward. Also, I don't understand how you can waste your time poring over those plaques when there is so much else to do. Not counting the fact that it probably cuts into what little spare time you have, remarked Resident Leary. I mean, it's your choice. It just seems odd to me. Startled by a noise behind them, they turned to see who was there. It was Resident Perceive, who was commenting on the subject as he came forward to them.
Well, actually, Victor Castle seems closer to the character of Creator King than it ever did before. As an inspector scrutinizing wares, I can say that. Sorry, I heard you talking as I walked up.
Resident Perceive was in his late 40s, slightly above average in height, and had broad, square shoulders. He had an intelligent, calm manner with the air of someone who is not often excited. He had slightly gray hair with gray eyes to match. He also had a lightly trimmed beard. Yeah, we were talking about the same thing again, replied Resident Adroit in a short, self-conscious chuckle. The character of Creator King. I'm inclined to hope he has a good character, continued Resident Leary, looking earnestly at Resident Resolve. But how are we to know when so many rumors fly in on the wings of the wind? He wondered, shaking his head and throwing up his hands. And do we really even know the character of Creator King? Asked Resident Adroit with a shrug and a questioning expression.
Well, we certainly know the character of Pernicious Accuser,
replied Resident Perceive with his eyebrows raised and gazing at the other residents in turn.
A sharper contrast never existed, and even though he puts his underlings in charge after he defeats a castle, for all intents and purposes, he is the lord of that defeated castle,
said Resident Perceive as 3 of them shuddered. Food for thought, said Leary as he looked skeptically at Resident Resolve, then at the grain crops ready for harvest, and last at Resident Adroit, who stood looking quizzically at his feet. Thank you, Resolve, Resident Leary replied, handing the sandstone back to him. Well, let's talk about it later, replied Resident Adroit, breaking the silence while still staring at his feet. There it goes again, Resident Leary almost interrupted, looking at the forest. There what goes again? Asked Resident Adroit, looking up and around.
Oh, just a bird call,
said Resident Resolve.
Nature sounds are so peaceful. It is nice that we live near a forest,
he continued. Wildlife seems to have a calming effect on people, Resident Adroit remarked, tugging at his hair in an absent-minded way.
Well, empty mouths can complain more, and that is not peaceful,
replied Resident Perceive as he eyed the grain.
We need to get some of this grain taken care of,
he remarked as he picked up a pitchfork. Right you are, agreed Resident Leary.
Most correct,
Resident Resolve chimed in. I wonder if or when he will attack us, said Resident Leary as he picked up a pitchfork and then looked admiringly at the noble walls.
I prefer not to think about it,
said Resident Resolve as he worked. I wonder what he is planning, wondered Resident Adroit out loud, wiping some sweat off his brow. The words in their minds was when, not if.
Let us enjoy our peace despite whatever Pernicious could be planning,
said Resident Resolve, cheerfully swinging his scythe and beginning to whistle a tune.
He is not going to steal my peace of mind,
replied Resident Perceive partly to himself. Their castle's distant image was reflected off the end of a shaded spyglass. Taking it from his eye, Colonel Devious, a henchman of Pernicious Accuser, smiled coldly with an icy look in his eyes. What the residents did not know was that there were spies in their midst, in the castle, whom they mistook for residents. But who were they? Wednesday, 9:40 a.m. The Guard Tower of Hearing. On the other side of the castle, Resident Candid was on guard duty in the Guard Tower of Hearing. Resident Candid caught sight of another alien approaching the castle with a bundle on his back. He looked as though he were going to pass right under the shut gates without saying anything to the inspector in the tower directly over the gate he was approaching. And you are? Resident Candid asked, gazing down at the alien while rubbing his hands together.
Who, me?
Yes, you. You did not think you could just walk in here, did you? He asked as he continued rubbing his hands together.
Well, I have some wares that will be of great use to Finite Castle.
But you have not told me who you are, or what is in that bundle there.
I am Alien Heedless from Rank Castle.
And what about those wares?
Oh, wonderful and exciting wares of secrets and amusements.
Well, that sounds rather vague to me. Or was that your intent? If I was not suspicious because of your wares, I am because of your manner. Do I look like I have the word gullible written on my face?
But this will really enliven and entertain Finite Castle.
Yes, well, if it comes to entertainment, we would rather be the ones choosing it, and not the ones to whom it is being offered. No, neither you or your wares are allowed in.
Oh.
Your manner screams suspicion, and I am going to obey my inclination and protect my peace of mind by refusing your request. You have 5 minutes to leave the immediate premises. With that, the alien's shoulders slumped, and with a grimace at Finite Castle and Inspector Candid, he walked dejectedly away. Wednesday, 9:30 p.m. In the forest across from Finite Castle. The sun had just disappeared behind Mount Peril to the west of the castle. A gentle evening breeze sifted through the tops of the wavering grasses as the faint echo of crickets resonated near a partially harvested field adjoining the distant forest. Whispers drifted like smoke out of a clump of weaving vines and dense foliage on the edge of the forest. Colonel Devious, removing the spyglass, glanced down with a frown and appeared to be thinking. A little distance behind him stood Lieutenant Subvert. "I imagine it is settling down for the night. Our spies will soon be here, now that the sun has set."
Correct,
replied the colonel. "The past 2 days of waiting have not been easy on our troops," the lieutenant said, glancing sideways at the colonel with an apprehensive expression.
I understand their desire for action, but the better we know our victim, Finet Castle, the better it can be defeated. Not only that, but I am waiting for approval from Radiance, our leader.
Emissary Zeal stood about 50 paces away, but could hear the slightest whisper. He was quite tall and slim, and he seemed to notice everything. He had black hair, dark eyes, and a noble, consecrated look. He had a habitual, honest, and benevolent expression. "It is unnerving that we are denied the relief of being able to plan the destruction of castles without interference from the enemy or them monitoring us," the lieutenant remarked as he cast a menacing glance at Emissary Zeal, who looked up from jotting something down. As the emissary surveyed the colonel and the lieutenant, he shrugged his shoulders, shook his head from side to side, and went back to jotting notes. The subordinate, in a less irritated tone of voice and in a derisive expression, continued. "And that castle, so deceived, like blindfolded prey running from a predator. That is one area in which our spies have done really well."
Yes, Lieutenant.
The colonel replied, taking the glass from his eye as he glanced to the side and turned around.
As I was watching those slackers earlier in the day, almost all they did was gawk at their wall. Most of the residents will trust our wall to save them from our attack of temptation. Well, the spies have done well in getting the residents to trust their wall instead of the enemy, although the residents' love of their wall has helped.
While the conversation went on, Emissary Zeal continued to glance from his notepad to the lieutenant and Colonel Devious as he continued to write information down.
As for the emissary taking notes over there, you know that those residents cannot hear him very well and that the residents do not speak his language. Since they trust their wall so much, as has been our plan, then that means they will probably trust our enemy less. I do feel a sense of sweet revenge when I think of their future under Radiance, their rightful ruler. What is it?
Colonel Devious replied to an exaggerated cough from a soldier behind him.
"Our informants are approaching."
At this, Colonel Devious turned around again, and in a swift movement, he shut the extending spyglass and followed the sentry closer to the clearing where there was a lot of mist. Out of the darkening mist, 2 hooded figures emerged with hesitant footsteps.
"Greetings, Colonel,"
said one spy with a nod. He was tall with a slim build, gray hair, and a mustache. He had a quick, facetious expression and an unscrupulous demeanor.
Your observation is to be commended.
The colonel replied with one eyebrow raised.
"We used the secret passage to come here as you instructed. I got your signal earlier, after which I alerted my coworker here. By the way, it was a perfect signal, Colonel,"
the second spy remarked, leaning against a tree. The second spy was a little shorter than the first spy, although he was about average in height, with a slim build and black hair. He had an observant manner and was often looking as if he were expecting something to happen.
"Yes, my coworker said that the residents he was with believed it to be a bird call,"
the spy replied with a sly nod at the other spy.
"Those half-witted residents are so naive, Colonel,"
the spy replied with mirth.
"Getting in by masquerading as wares worked well, and now that we are residents of Finet Castle, there is nothing the residents can do to force us out. If at some point they do try to force us out, then they will be in for a surprise,"
he remarked, fidgeting.
"It's almost too easy,"
the other spy said, tossing aside a small stone, which quickly vanished into the fog in the opposite direction.
I should think you will try to treat the situation more seriously.
The colonel replied, eyeing them very closely.
Other than that, What you have done so far is precisely what I want.
He continued, nodding his head.
It is good to hear that all is going smoothly.
Well, not quite.
The second spy replied, glancing downward and darting his eyes uneasily from side to side.
There are a few problems.
He said with a cringe, glancing up at the colonel.
This castle has plaques.
He said, letting out a frustrated sigh.
We discovered this fact today. We know that they did have plaques long ago, but who could have known they would remain inside a castle for so long without any outward clues that they were still there and not rusted away? Also, some of the emissaries from our enemy keep poisoning the minds of the less gullible residents to trust the enemy. So far, when it has happened, and we have seen that it has not happened much, we start discussions about the king and spreading rumors whether they are false or not.
We have been very careful so as to keep the wool over their blind eyes.
The other spy replied in agreement.
Plaques? I suspected as much.
The colonel replied as he turned his back.
It is difficult to conceive that a failed attack from so long ago could still cause us problems. Well, your efforts are commendable. Now, at the right time, carefully mention or bring the conversations of the residents to center on anything but our enemy, and interject false rumors or ideas about him whenever appropriate. And should a conversation regarding the enemy's so-called goodness come up, one of you should lovingly mention the walls, towers, or say something about our enemy which would make them doubt him. Covertly try to change the subject. To be safe, you should occasionally be seen disagreeing with one another so no one will suspect that you are working together. Also remember that some of the residents will do the disbelieving or subject changing for you.
Yes, Colonel, this has happened several times. The fact that they speak our language and cannot understand Theopolis has helped greatly.
One spy replied.
Well, that is encouraging.
Replied the colonel.
Are these residents anything like our slaves in Asunder Castle?
He asked with one eyebrow raised.
What are the residents like?
Some are as weak as water, Colonel.
One spy replied.
But a few stubborn ones will not surrender their fantasies about the enemy. Worse is the fact that some of them have a strong influence over others who are inclined to believe us.
The spy continued, looking down in disgust. Glancing to the side and then up at the colonel, he continued.
These annoying residents can hear the emissaries more clearly than others can.
The colonel thought for a second.
Now when these residents become irritating, discreetly impress on them these stubborn ones and the weaker ones the supposed grandeur of their wall as it appears to them. This might help shift the attention of these few away from our enemy to their wall. The less they think of our enemy, the greater their doubt and distrust of him will be. Distraction, delay, and detours are key words to remember.
For a moment, the colonel looked sideways, deep in thought, his eyes darting here and there. After a moment of silence, he turned again to his spies.
One more thing. As you all know, I have been closely observing Finite Castle for the last 3 weeks and reporting to our leader. From the looks of their 5 gates, it is possible that they are closer to the enemy than some of his other ill-fated subjects have been. They might run to him in the face of defeat. Now, Radiance told me that he's sending one of his elite spies from his slave Asunder Castle to help us. He will not arrive for a day, so he might have to get through in one of the 5 gates. Now, I know that he infiltrated Asunder Castle easily enough and was instrumental in helping to sabotage it. I will rest easier if he is there to help you.
I am wondering, Lieutenant Sabert asked with his head slightly up and turned sideways, how did you manage to exit Finite Castle without detection?
Well, Lieutenant,
replied one spy with a gesture towards the mist.
There is a secret passageway under the walls and then to the river, which comes out of a cave hidden by thick bushes. It leads out of the ravine we just ascended. From there, we made our way to the edge of the forest, and here we are.
He finished. I see, the lieutenant replied. What is the name of this one?
It is called the Secret Passage of Conscience.
The other spy replied slyly.
You must be careful.
replied the colonel.
A castle of this sort will try to block such a passage if they knew about it.
I am sure that there are other weaknesses in the structure of the castle we could use to our advantage if this secret was revealed to them, but I see what you mean, Colonel.
The spy replied, nodding his head.
It's better to be safe than sorry.
We cannot let one chance or one opportunity of corruption pass by us without using every means at our disposal to our advantage. We must consider any and all tools that help us to wage war against them, particularly their own weaknesses.
I have a good feeling about this.
replied one spy.
Oh, and with good reason.
Replied the other spy.
With you to attack them on the outside and us to sabotage them from within, what chance do they have?
He continued with a smug look.
Well, you should head back before someone gets suspicious.
With that, the spies melted into the mist in the direction of the ravine and the castle. Under the shadow of night, Emissary Zeal headed towards a planned meeting to discuss the fate of Finite Castle.